years old today. What we found out in this budget is a confirmation that the federal budget will not be balanced until you're 50 years old, and you will be paying for the $1 trillion in debt.
During what one hopes will be the one single Liberal mandate, they will have managed to rack up a deficit of $100 billion with nothing to show for it.
The opposition leader is not too impressed with today's budget. So, how was your budget day? Still haven't made up your mind? Maybe Andrew, Chantal, and Jennifer Ditchburn can help. They're all in Ottawa tonight. Andrew, you start us. I mean, they were pretty direct, the opposition leaders, as they always are on days like this, but have they got a point?
Well, it's a strange budget. It's a complacent budget. It's a failure in many ways. I'm not sure whether it's worse because of what it does or what it doesn't do, but taking off the top what it doesn't do, it doesn't treat the deficit seriously at all. Every time they restate the figures, the deficit situation worsens. The time when we're ever going to get back to a balanced budget recedes further and further into the future. They seem to show no concern for that, whatever. And then we have this strange kind of reshuffling of the deck with their various programs for encouraging innovation. We know from a recent report that there's already 147 different programs. They've added a bunch, reshuffled a bunch of others. But what they don't see is a serious program for encouraging innovation and productivity, which would involve reforming our tax system, getting the tax rates much lower than they are, opening our economy to more competition, to give that kind of stimulus to productivity. We know what's coming down the pike, at least in the broad strokes from the Trump administration, the Congress. I don't see why we have to wait until they actually pass legislation there to get started. Why not get started now?
Chantal?
I thought it was a very cynical budget in the sense that it opens up all kinds of possibilities, but commits the government to very little, in this year, to very little spending to back it up. It triggers a lot of spending just in time for the election, but leaves it open once the government is re-elected or not, whether those programs continue. And you and I were around when the Conservatives ran, for instance, on the national childcare program in '88. Mostly talked about free trade. That was in the picture. Day after the election, never heard from again. You
know, you two are making the opposition leaders sound kind in what they had to say. Something tells me Jennifer may be taking a different approach. Jennifer.
Well, I mean, it wasn't lighting my hair on fire, this budget, but I think that there's interesting thinking there. They're obviously doing the right kind of policy thinking around skills, around the changing nature of work, around innovation, climate change, and the people in society that don't necessarily benefit from economic growth. It's just that a lot of these things that they talked about, there was really sketchy details, or as Chantal pointed out, the rollout isn't for 10, 11, over a period of 10, 11 years, or there's no spending for 2 or 3 years, or there's just very minimal expenditure on some of their different initiatives. So to me, it's kind of a mixed bag. It's as if they're on the right road, but they ran out of fuel as they were going along. You
know, I tried to get him on the deficit at the top of the program. Rosie Barton earlier today went after him on, like, how is this going to work? How are you going to sell this, that it's going to make a difference in the economy? And here was his answer. Watch this.
Investing is what optimistic countries do, investing in sectors where we know we can beat the world. So you mentioned agriculture, digital technology, advanced manufacturing, health, life sciences, clean technology, natural resources. These are places where Canadians know that we have an advantage. We're going to invest, and what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that for those Canadians that want to be in those sectors, we'll help them to get the skills so that they can really get the great jobs.
Okay, does that fly, Chantal?
Except they're not going to be investing anytime soon, or maybe not very much until the next election. The problem with government is that government is about setting priorities and making choices. And this is like a buffet where no one is making a choice. It says, if you show up, all these things might be on the table, but we're not going to tell you which ones we're really going to accomplish. So at the end of the day, it sounds more like what they hope to be their platform for the next election than a program for a government that is actually in power.
How do you sell, or can you sell, what they put on the table today, Jennifer?
Well, I think there's a few areas that they could sell. It's just that, the story is mitigated. So, for example, I think you can sell the fact that you're talking about putting a bunch of money into childcare. This is an issue that's important to women across the country. It cuts across class levels, income levels. But it's not nearly enough money that's needed to give the spaces that Canadian parents need. And the funding is over a long period of time, and they don't have an agreement with the provinces yet. It's sort of a wait and see what will happen. So I think if there was any selling point, it would be on the parental leave, change to parental leave childcare spaces, and also some changes to help for people who want to improve their skills. Those are the three areas I think stand out.
Andrew?
I was struck by the minister's certainty that these were can't-miss, surefire, definite winners, these industries that he'd selected. If that's the case, then you would think people who are investing their own money would be at least as capable of realizing that as the government. So this enthusiasm for picking winners, which is, has a long and rather sordid history of handing out grants to businesses that can't hack it on their own, is not a particularly sterling track record. And why the Liberals have now decided that this is the height of innovative thinking, 1970-style industrial policy, is a great mystery.
Oh, but it makes for great announcements and photo ops in an election campaign.
That's very
and it
true.
keeps people on side because money you don't have yet. And I've just come back from one of the multiple, stakeholders and other parties tonight. The money you don't have that's in the window keeps you saying nice things about the government in the hope of getting it. So it's politically palatable. It may not be terribly responsible.
That's the thing, is they're spraying money in 500 different directions in little micro droplets. And every person who receives that money, there's no doubt they will be grateful. And as Chantal says, eager for more. But the sum total of the impact on the economy, and particularly when, as I say, productivity and innovation is absolutely a critical concern for the country. The government's right to identify that as a concern. But this approach is not going to be helpful.
On the issue of the deficit, we saw today, as I pointed out to the minister, two very different approaches to deal with the deficit. Saskatchewan government, which has obviously a much smaller deficit, but they decided to attack it today, raising certain taxes, doing a few other things. This government, no, they're not going after the deficit. At least they're not going after it yet in any significant way. Is there a right and wrong anymore on the deficit issue, Jennifer?
Well, they seem to be focused on the debt to GDP ratio, and according to their projections, that's not going to change. And they sort of box themselves into, okay, we're going to keep it at, well, I think it's around 30% or 31%. So I think they've kind of, deficit is a word that they just don't use anymore. But it's difficult to cut spending. I mean, when you leave things underfunded, you get into a situation where, like we have now, where children who live on reserves in Canada aren't getting the same welfare treatment as children who live in different provinces. I mean, where are you going to cut? That's the problem that every government has. And we have to admit, there were areas in government that were left underfunded for a long time, and they had to be addressed at some point.
It is called making choices, though, and that is what governing is about. And this budget is free of any choices at some point. It leaves the federal government at the mercy of whatever happens to the world economy and interest rates. It also builds up, and this budget offers little structural that will be staying. They're all things that you can say, well, this deficit now is out of control, so I'm not going to do any of these things. And in the end, you will have squandered a lot of money, built a deficit, and gotten very little in return.
All right. And